Welcome back to Palestine Bookshelf. I'm Stephen Heiner, and today we're going to be talking about the King-Crane Report. This was a report that was put together by two Americans in 1919 after World War I, in which America was trying to get a handle on what was going on in the Middle East so that it could make recommendations or take actions at the peace conference. The report ends up ultimately getting suppressed because it made recommendations against Zionism and Zionists' aims, and as we know, there can be no dissent against Zionist aims, and that's why the report had to go. Now, this document was cited in so many different books that I've read, I thought it's time to actually get to the primary source and read it myself, and it's a really fascinating document. It covers a lot of different parts of the Middle East. It talks about Mesopotamia, so obviously it would be Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Iraq. It talks about Syria, even talks about Turkey, Armenia, Greece. Not going to talk about all of those today. I'm going to focus specifically on the area of Palestine and the Zionist aims in Palestine and confine the reading of the report to that. So let's start by finding out who the gentlemen are. Dr. Henry Churchill King was born at Hillsdale, Michigan in 1858. He was president of Oberlin College and one of America's best-known educators, as well as the author of numerous volumes on theology, education, and philosophy. During 1918 to 1919, he was director of religious work for the YMCA in France. In September 1919, he was appointed to serve on the American section of the Peace Conference Inter-Allied Commission on Mandates in Turkey. Charles R. Crane was born at Chicago, Illinois in 1858. He was engaged in the manufacturing business in that city for more than a quarter of a century. He was a member of President Wilson's Special Diplomatic Commission to Russia in 1917, was a member of the American section of the Peace Conference Inter-Allied Commission on Mandates in Turkey in 1919, American ambassador to China from May 1920 to June 1921. These are no amateurs. These are serious people who went over to represent American interests and to listen to the population there. And here is part of the flyer that they gave. Flyer, it was a statement that was distributed everywhere they went. The American people, having no political ambitions in Europe or the Near East, preferring, if that were possible, to keep clear of all European, Asian, or African entanglements, but nevertheless sincerely desiring that the most permanent peace and the largest results for humanity shall come out of this war, recognize that they cannot altogether avoid responsibility for just settlements among the nations following the war and under the League of Nations. In that spirit, they approach the problems of the Near East. And there was actually plenty of American isolationism in 1919, so this very much captures the American zeitgeist at the time. Obviously, it wouldn't later. An international commission was projected by the Council of Four of the Peace Conference to study conditions in the Turkish Empire with reference to possible mandates. The American section of that commission is in the Near East simply and solely to get as accurate and definite information as possible concerning the conditions, the relations, and the desires of all the peoples and classes concerned, in order that President Wilson and the American people may act with full knowledge of the facts in any policy they may be called upon hereafter to adopt concerning the problems of the Near East, whether in the Peace Conference or in the later League of Nations. The commissioners were struck with a large degree of frankness with which opinions were expressed to them, even where there was evident fear of consequences. In this respect, the American section had an evident advantage, which could not have held for a mixed commission, meaning including the French or the British. Moreover, the nearly universal recognition of the fact that America sought no additional territory was favorable to a frank expression of doctrine. So you can be more honest with people who you don't think are going to move into your neighborhood, which was, again, true at the time. So this is part of, we're not into the recommendations yet. This is just a narrative reporting as to what has happened. Owing to changes of plan at a late date, the commission arrived in Jaffa at a time when the British authorities were not expecting it, and the program followed there was arranged mainly without their help. The endeavor was made to ascertain the opinions and desires of every important group, sect, and organization, of a few well-informed representative individuals, and of significant minorities or subdivisions, especially in cases where there seemed to be disposition, for any reason, to suppress these. Because of the numerous subdivisions of the Christians, and particularly of the Roman Catholics, it was inevitable that from the beginning the Commission would give a disproportionate number of interviews and amount of time to them. The commissioners had prepared a statement of their purposes to be found elsewhere in this report, which was read to important groups and given to the press in lieu of interviews. Care was taken to make it clear, in response to frequent questioning, that the policy of the United States in regard to accepting a mandate anywhere was unformed and unpredictable, and that the Commission had no power of decision. This was interesting to me. I didn't know, because I need to probably go back and study the peace conference. I didn't even know that America would have even considered accepting any of these mandates. It's an interesting what-if historical scenario. Automobiles were secured from the American Committee for Relief in the Near East in order to be as little as possible dependent upon others than Americans. Word was given out that the Commission would not accept general social invitations or consent to demonstrations. As to the wishes of the people, the Muslims constitute about 4/5 of the actual population of Palestine, according to a recent British census. Except for certain official groups, they were practically unanimous for the independence of United Syria and were responsive to the current political influences. Now, when you're talking about United Syria, they're thinking about it in Ottoman terms, so it's Syria, the Lebanon, and Palestine as one unified idea. The organizations met at Jaffa took the position that Syria is capable of self-government without a mandatory power, but if one should be insisted upon by the peace conference, they preferred the United States. The Christians of Palestine, who altogether constitute less than 10% of the population, showed more difference of opinion. Some groups in the north, as the Latin Catholics of Tiberias and Haifa, and most of the Christians of Nazareth, were with the Muslims for independence and the reference to Damascus. So again, this idea of a unified Syria. Maronites and Greek Catholics, and usually the Latin Catholics, were for a French mandate. The Greek Orthodox everywhere, according to an agreed program, were for a British mandate, as were several scattering groups. None asked directly for the United States, though the opinion was expressed that if there were assurance that we would come if asked, most Christians would favor this solution. Yeah, again, really interesting, and as I say, a what if. What if America had been given the mandate? I suppose that's something to muse for another time. So, going up towards the Lebanon and Syria, and they repeated talking to the public, wishes of the people in this area. In general, the situation was in accordance with that in Palestine and Damascus. With few exceptions, the Muslims were for American or British assistance according to the Damascus program. The Druze were for an English mandate. The Maronites and all varieties of Catholics were for France. But the Greek Orthodox were divided, instead of standing for a British mandate as usually in Palestine and Damascus. And now there are some conditions put together by the Syrian Congress at Damascus. There's an allusion to this gathering at the end of both Seven Pillars of Wisdom and the film Lawrence of Arabia. If you want to see a review I did of Seven Pillars of Wisdom, I'll link to it. From the time of reaching Jerusalem, the commission began to be told of a congress that was in preparation to be held soon at Damascus, which would, for a large part of the population, determine the question of a mandate. Sessions were held while the commission was at Damascus, and on the last day there, a deputation presented to the commission the program that had been prepared. We, the undersigned, members of the General Syrian Congress, meeting in Damascus on Wednesday, July the 2nd, 1919, made up of representatives from 3 zones, the southern, eastern, and western, provided with credentials and authorizations by the inhabitants of our various districts, Muslims, Christians, and Jews, have agreed upon the following statement of the desires of the people of the country who have elected us to present them to the American section of the International Commission. The 5th article was passed by a very large majority. All the other articles were accepted unanimously. So why don't we start with that 5th point? I'm not going to read all of them. Let's read the 5th one first. Very large majority. In the event of America not finding herself in a position to accept our desire for assistance, we will seek this assistance from Great Britain, also provided that such assistance does not infringe the complete independence and unity of our country, and that the duration of such assistance does not exceed that mentioned in the previous article. All right, I will read a few of the articles 3. Considering the fact that the Arabs inhabiting the Syrian area are not naturally less gifted than other more advanced races, and that they are by no means less developed than the Bulgarians, Serbians, Greeks, and Romanians at the beginning of their independence, we protest against Article 22 of the Covenant of the League of Nations, placing us among the nations in their middle stage of development, which stand in need of a mandatory power. Point 4. In the event of the rejection by the Peace Conference of this just protest for certain considerations that we may not understand, we, relying on the declarations of President Wilson, that his object in waging war was to put an end to the ambition of conquest and colonization, can only regard the mandate mentioned in the Covenant of the League of Nations as equivalent to the rendering of economical and technical assistance that does not prejudice our complete independence. And desiring that our country should not fall a prey to colonization, and believing that the American nation is farthest from any thought of colonization and has no political ambition in our country, we will seek the technical and economic assistance from the United States of America, provided that such assistance does not exceed 20 years. I mean, it's remarkable to read something like that. Think about the prestige and the social capital and the power America wielded, soft power, not military power, moral power, that they say, hey, if America's going to come, we'll accept it, and it's just as long as you don't stay more than 20 years. They're willing to allow the Americans to come and stay for 20 years. It's extraordinary. And conversely, to the position towards the Americans, here's point 6. We do not acknowledge any right claimed by the French government in any part whatever of our Syrian country, and refuse that she should assist us or have a hand in our country under any circumstances and in any place. And I think I'm probably going to have to do some research as to why the French were so opposed here, but it's clear that they were. Point 7, we oppose the pretensions of the Zionists to create a Jewish commonwealth in the southern part of Syria, known as Palestine, and oppose Zionist migration to any part of our country, for we do not acknowledge their title, but consider them a grave peril to our people from the national, economical, and political points of view. Our Jewish compatriots shall enjoy our common rights and assume the common responsibilities. So they're welcome to live there, but they cannot constitute a state of their own. And point 8, we ask that there should be no separation of the southern part of Syria, known as Palestine, nor of the literal western zone, which includes Lebanon, from the Syrian country. We desire that the unity of the country should be guaranteed against partition under whatever circumstances. So here you can see there was a larger narrative of a unified Syria, a greater Syria, which there's still some talk about that to this day. Obviously, Syria has its own problems without worrying about this, but this dominated thinking from 1919 all the way up until 1948, and that was part of what held up the Syrian army at the border. They were afraid because of what they thought were Hashemite pretensions to Syria and creating that greater Syria. If you want to learn more about that, I'll put a link to my reviews on the War on Palestine, parts 1 and 2. So as they're reflecting, King and Crane, on what they've just reported, they say the gravity of the Syrian problem is further to be seen in certain well-known facts. The fact that the Arabic-speaking portion of the Turkish Empire has been the birthplace of the three great religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and that Palestine contains places sacred to all three, makes inevitably a center of interest and concern for the whole civilized world. No solution which is merely local or has only a single people in mind can avail. On the other hand, the practical obstacles to the unity of Syria are the apparent unwillingness of either the British or the French to withdraw from Syria, the British from Palestine or the French from Beirut and the Lebanon, the intense opposition of the Arabs and the Christians to the Zionist program, the common Lebanese demand for complete separate independence, the strong feeling of the Arabs of the East against any French control, the fear on the part of many Christians of Muslim domination, and the lack of as vigorous a Syrian national feeling as could be desired. These obstacles will be discussed in the recommendations of the commissioners. And what's fascinating about that, just that paragraph, is a listing of all of the conflicting interests that were here. And the previous note was, we can't only take one people into consideration as we try to please everybody and displease everybody. I'm just going to read through the objections again because I think they're fascinating. It's all here in one paragraph. Why can't we have a unified Syria? This would be Lebanon, Palestine, and what we now know as Syria. The apparent unwillingness of either the British or the French to withdraw. That's a pretty big problem. The intense opposition of the Arabs and the Christians to the Zionists, the common Lebanese demand for complete separate independence, talked about the fact that the Maronites felt in the Maronite collective consciousness, there's fear of Muslim invasion, and they wanted protection in their own state. If you want to know more, I can link to a live stream that I did talking about Lebanon. The strong feeling of the Arabs of the East against any French control. And as I said, I'm going to have to do some research as to why the French were so opposed. The fear on the part of many Christians of Muslim domination. Okay, fair enough. And the lack of as vigorous Assyrian national feeling as could be desired. Remember, they'd been under the Ottomans for a long time. So the idea of Assyria that was a country as opposed to a region and a territory was new. We recommend that the unity of Syria be preserved in accordance with the earnest petition of the great majority of the people of Syria. The territory concerned is too limited, the population too small, and the economic, geographic, racial, and language unity too manifest to make the setting up of independent states within its boundaries desirable. If such division can possibly be avoided, the country is very largely Arab in language, culture, traditions, and customs. So King Crane recommended against the partition of Syria into 3 different countries, which is what ended up happening. We recommend, in the 5th place, serious modification of the extreme Zionist program for Palestine of unlimited immigration of Jews, looking finally to making Palestine distinctly a Jewish state. And if King and Crane had known about the Israel lobby, they would have known this is where the report was going to be completely ignored from this point on. We know that now, but now you can read all of the horrible anti-Semitic stuff that follows, quote unquote. The commissioners began their study of Zionism with minds predisposed in its favor, but the actual facts in Palestine, coupled with the force of the general principles proclaimed by the Allies and accepted by the Syrians, have driven them to the recommendation here made. As I say, people have ideas, they go to Palestine, they talk to the locals, and they change their mind. Nobody ever goes to Palestine, talks to the locals, and then says, oh, the Zionists are right. That's always what happens. Look, back here in 1919, they thought, yes, I'm generally predisposed to like Zionism. I go, I find out it's not such a great idea. The commission was abundantly supplied with literature on the Zionist program by the Zionist Commission to Palestine, heard in conferences much concerning the Zionist colonies and their claims, and personally saw something of what had been accomplished. They found much to approve in the aspirations and plans of the Zionists and had warm appreciation for the devotion of many of the colonists and for their success by modern methods in overcoming natural obstacles. The Commission recognized also that definite encouragement had been given to the Zionists by the Allies in Mr. Balfour's often quoted statement and in its approval by other representatives of the Allies. If, however, the strict terms of the Balfour Statement are adhered to, favoring the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights existing in non-Jewish communities in Palestine. So he's just quoting directly from the declaration. It can hardly be doubted that the extreme Zionist program must be greatly modified, if we're going to accept the Balfour Statement at its word. A national home for the Jewish people is not equivalent to making Palestine into a Jewish state, nor can the erection of such a Jewish state be accomplished without the gravest trespass upon the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. The fact came out repeatedly in the Commission's conference with Jewish representatives that the Zionists look forward to a practical complete dispossession of the present non-Jewish inhabitants of Palestine by various forms of purchase. So let's even take the most peaceful and benefit of the doubt, you could say, perspective. They're going to buy all of Palestine. And that's how they were going to get the land, despite the fact that that had not had a lot of progress up until 1919. So they were presenting them with something that wasn't realistic. In his address of July the 4th, 1918, President Wilson laid down the following principle as one of the 4 great ends for which the associated peoples of the world are fighting. The settlement of every question, whether of territory, of sovereignty, of economic arrangement, or of political relationship, upon the basis of the free acceptance of that settlement by the people immediately concerned, and not upon the basis of the material interest or advantage of any other nation or people which may desire a different settlement for the sake of its own exterior influence or mastery. If that principle is to rule, and so the wishes of Palestine's population are to be decisive as to be what is to be done with Palestine, then it is to be remembered that the non-Jewish population of Palestine, nearly 9/10 of the whole, are emphatically against the entire Zionist program, 90%. The tables show that there was no one thing upon which the population of Palestine was more agreed upon than this: to subject a people so minded to unlimited Jewish immigration, and to steady financial and social pressure to surrender the land, would be a gross violation of the principle just quoted, and of the people's rights, though it kept within the forms of law. I mean, I can't say it any better myself. It is to be noted also that the feeling against the Zionist program is not confined to Palestine, but shared very generally by the people throughout Syria, as our conferences clearly showed. More than 72%, 1,350 in all the petitions in the whole of Syria were directed against the Zionist program. Only 2 requests, those for a united Syria and for independence, had a larger support. This general feeling was voiced by the General Syrian Congress in the 7th, 8th, and 10th resolutions of the statement, of which I think I read some. The peace conference should not shut its eyes to the fact that the anti-Zionist feeling in Palestine and Syria is intense and not lightly to be flouted. No British officer consulted by the commissioners believed that the Zionist program could be carried out except by force of arms. The officers generally thought that a force of not less than 50,000 soldiers would be required even to initiate the program. That of itself is evidence of a strong sense of the injustice of the Zionist program. Yeah, you need 50,000 soldiers to do what you want. On the part of the non-initial claim, often submitted by Zionist representatives, that they have a right to Palestine based on an occupation of 2,000 years ago, can hardly be seriously considered. Oh, again, cancelable offense to say something like that today. There is a further consideration that cannot be justly ignored if the world is to look forward to Palestine becoming a definitely Jewish state, however gradually that may take place. This consideration grows out of the fact that Palestine is the holy land for Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. Millions of Christians and Muslims all over the world are quite as much concerned as the Jews with conditions in Palestine, especially with those conditions which touch upon religious feeling and rights. The relations in these matters in Palestine are most delicate and difficult. With the best possible intentions, it may be doubted whether the Jews could possibly seem to either Christians or Muslims proper guardians of the holy places, or custodians of the Holy Land as a whole. And this is something that Herzl put forward in The Jewish State. I'll put a link to that in the video, and if I've got room for a card. The reason is this: the places which are most sacred to Christians, those having to do with Jesus, and which are also sacred to Muslims, are not only not sacred to Jews, but abhorrent to them. It is simply impossible under those circumstances for Muslims and Christians to feel satisfied to have these places in Jewish hands or under the custody of Jews. There are still other places about which Muslims must have the same feeling. In fact, from this point of view, the Muslims, just because the sacred places of all 3 religions are sacred to them, have made very naturally much more satisfactory custodians of the holy places than the Jews could be. It must be believed that the precise meaning in this respect of the complete Jewish occupation of Palestine has not been fully sensed by those who urge the extreme Zionist program, for it would intensify, with a certainty like fate, the anti-Jewish feeling both in Palestine and in all other portions of the world which look to Palestine as the Holy Land. Sounds like a warning, sounds like a prophecy. It's more than 100 years later. It's all true. In view of all these considerations, and with a deep sense of sympathy for the Jewish cause, the commissioners feel bound to recommend that only a greatly reduced Zionist program be attempted by the peace conference, and even that only very gradually initiated. This would have to mean that Jewish immigration should be definitely limited, and that the project for making Palestine distinctly a Jewish commonwealth should be given up. This was written by people who went to Palestine, talked to the people, heard what they had to say, and reported without prejudice, even saying that they were predisposed to Zionism when they came. But they came, they talked to the locals, they saw the conditions, and they realized what was being asked for, quote-unquote asked for, was not reasonable. So, as I said, there's a lot more in the report. I don't have time to get into it. In a sense, it's not really, this is Palestine bookshelf, not necessarily Turkey, Armenia, Greece, Syria bookshelf. Those countries do play a role in understanding Palestine, and I will cover books relating to those countries over time. But today in the King Crane report, I just specifically wanted to go over the recommendations against Zionism and the total general population's unified feeling, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, at the Damascus conference, that the Zionist program was not to be allowed to continue. So if you enjoyed this review, please hit like, please share it with somebody, consider subscribing to the channel, consider supporting my work either with a super thanks, or there's a buy me a coffee link, there's a PayPal link. Use those. If you want to support my work on an ongoing basis, if you really like this, consider joining my Patreon, heading over to my Substack, or becoming a YouTube member. All of these are going to give you access to other forms of what I'm doing here, whether that's early articles, whether it's a chance to talk with me behind the scenes, early releases of videos. Having an ongoing group of members engage with these topics means I've got more time that I can dedicate to this, which is something I'd like to do. If you'd like to think about contributing to a book in 2025, I have my Amazon wish list linked as well, so you can pick books that you'd be interested in, send them to me. I may review them next year. And a reminder that ongoing for Palestine Bookshelf, we donate a portion of the proceeds that we get from all these different sources to the Palestine Children's Relief Fund, which is a wonderful organization that helps Palestinian children get medical care who could not otherwise get it. Until next time, enjoy your reading.